Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center for Public Affairs at the University of Virginia and dedicated to the proposition articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor, and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center. My normal partner in this enterprise, Elliot Cohen, is traveling in Europe, so once again, I'm flying solo, but I have a very special guest and a former colleague and friend, Ambassador Stephen Pifer. Ambassador Pifer was ambassador to Ukraine, but has had a long and distinguished foreign service career. He was an advisor to the U.S. INF delegation, an advisor to the late Paul Nitze, who negotiated the INF Treaty. He was senior director for Russia and Ukraine in the NSC in the Clinton administration. He was a deputy assistant secretary of state, and he served in Warsaw and London, as well as Moscow, where he and I were colleagues in the U.S. Embassy political section. He's also an author. He is the author of The Eagle and the Trident, U.S.-Ukraine Relations in Turbulent Times, and co-author with Mike O'Hanlon, who we hope to have on to discuss his new book soon, a book on the opportunity about the prospects for arms control, the book which I actually even went and blurbed. So, Steve, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thanks very much, Eric.
So today is VE Day. Tomorrow will be Victory Day in Moscow, and they will have a parade of some sort, although it's not clear how large that parade will be, and a lot of extra steps for security have taken place. Before we get into that, though, as a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, why does all of this matter to Americans? I mean, increasingly you see in some polling that there are concerns about this turning into an endless war. You see some, particularly on the Republican side, questioning the value of the U.S. assistance to Ukraine. Why should we care about this?
That's a good question to ask. I mean, Ukraine's 5,000 miles away. We have to worry about things like the rise of China. But let me give you several reasons why I believe what's going on in this war matters greatly to American interests. First of all, going back nearly 70 years, the United States has defined as a vital national interest a stable and secure Europe. There are political, economic, security reasons for that. How this war before Russia and Ukraine turns out is going to have a big impact on the kind of Europe that we face. Should Russia win, it's going to be an unstable and insecure Europe, and that's going to require a lot more American attention in the future. A second rule is, again, since the World War II, we've had this idea of the rules-based international order, which I believe has served not only Western interests well, but most countries. I mean, China, under those rules, lifted 600 million people out of poverty. Well, the fundamental or the first rule of that order is you don't use military force to take territory from other countries. That's exactly what Putin is doing in a war that really looks somewhat imperialist. The third reason I think we should be caring is that I have to be humble. We don't know how far Vladimir Putin's ambitions extend. Should he prevail in Ukraine, would his ambitions go beyond that? He's talked in the past about this war against Ukraine as recovering historic Russian land. Well, look at a map of the Russian Empire in the 19th century. Finland, the Baltic states, much of Poland were part of that Russian Empire, and therefore, in Putin's views, may be historic Russian lands. In Ukraine, we're sending money and weapons. In eastern Estonia, we'd be sending American troops. Now, I don't think this is a high probability that it goes beyond Ukraine. But I think 3 or 4 years, Eric, had somebody asked us, we would have said the probability of the kind of war that we've seen Russia inflict on Ukraine over the past 15 months would be a very small probability. And I think the last reason we should care is that 30 years ago, we told Ukraine we would care. Ukraine, at the end of when the Soviet Union collapsed, had on its territory the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. And that included 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads that could target the United States. Ukraine gave those weapons up in large part because of the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, in which Russia, the United States, and Britain committed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, its territorial integrity, its independence, and committed not to use force or threaten to use force against Ukraine. Now, when we negotiated that, the Ukrainians said, "What will you Americans do if the Russians violate this?" And we said, "We will take an interest, we will do things." We did say that we were not prepared to commit American troops. So it's a memorandum of assurances, not guarantees. And that word is important, I think, to most American ears, or at least American diplomatic ears. But I think it's important that we live up to that commitment. So I do think that what's going on in Ukraine matters greatly, and we do have a big interest in how this war turns out.
I just would add to your description of the Budapest Memorandum that in addition to Russia, the US, and the UK, France subsequently associated itself with the assurances as well, the negative security assurances provided
Yeah,
to Ukraine.
as did China. Both the Chinese and the French separately did. Yeah.
So let's get to the current moment. Just the other day, we saw this drone attack, two drones uh, attacking the Kremlin grounds, the Kremlin complex. One of them exploding and creating some fire damage on the roof of the Senate building in the Kremlin complex. Lots of speculation about what this is. Was it a Ukrainian attack? The Russians, of course, were quick to say this was an assassination attempt against Putin, which the United States was actually behind, since all the decisions were made in Washington, not in Kyiv. Many people have suggested this is actually a Russian false flag. Others have said it could be Ukrainian partisans inside Russia or Russian dissidents opposed to the Kremlin's war, or even right-wing nationalist opponents of Putin who are angry that he's not prosecuting the war aggressively enough, who want to embarrass him. I mean, a lot of different speculation, Steve. As a longtime observer of this part of the world, what do you make of it?
Yeah, I don't totally exclude that the Ukrainians might be behind this, but I think it's much more likely that this is a false flag operation. I mean, you have seen in the past, well, actually going back into probably summer of 2022, the Russians enhanced their air defenses around Moscow, including they have air defense systems in place on the top of the Ministry of Defense and several other buildings that are literally within a mile surrounding the Kremlin. So we're asked to believe that these drones came from somewhere outside, penetrated several rings of air defenses around Moscow, including that inner ring of buildings, and then were only shot down over the Kremlin, coincidentally in the view of many cameras. Okay, maybe the Ukrainians pulled that off, but it also seems to me that this could have been the Russians doing it. It's also interesting, well, two other points. One is the Russians said this was an attempt to assassinate Putin. However, everyone knows, and certainly the Ukrainians know, that Putin rarely spends a night in the Kremlin. He's usually at his complex southwest of Moscow. So it would have been much more believable, perhaps, had there been an attack directed at that, if in fact the argument was this was an assassination attempt. But then, Eric, I remember I was in Moscow. I was assigned at the embassy in Moscow. I was actually in Helsinki for a couple of days when this happened. But in 1987, Matthias Rutz, a German, flew a Cessna from Finland into the Soviet Union, landed on the bridge right opposite of Red Square, and by all accounts was not at all molested by any of Russia's or the Soviets' vaunted air defenses. Within a day or two, you had the Minister of Defense fired, the head of Soviet air defenses fired. As far as can tell, nobody has been fired for this flagrant violation of air security over the Kremlin. So that, to my mind, points to this being a false flag operation that was designed for, as I think the purpose is not really clear to me. And I think it may have in fact backfired, as there's some reporting that seems to suggest that this increased the unease of people in Moscow when these things are going in like this.
Yeah, I agree. I think, anybody who confidently tells you they are certain about what happened, is probably wrong. I mean, I think we, don't know enough yet. But I'm with you. I find the failure to hold anybody accountable for what would be a enormous lapse in air defense and a huge embarrassment right before the May 9th parade and ceremony. That it's just inexplicable to me, unless there was some Russian hand in this.
Yeah.
Of course, you pointed out the Russian air defenses. I mean, in part in response to this, the Russians launched a whole barrage of missiles and drones at Kyiv, and the Ukrainians intercepted 35 out of 35 headed towards Kyiv the other night, apparently. So, I mean, at a minimum, this suggests perhaps Russian air defenses are not quite what they're cracked up to be, and the Ukrainians are maybe better at air defense than we give them or have heretofore given them credit, which raises a question about the much talked about, yet to begin, Ukrainian counteroffensive that people have been talking about for some time. There's been a lot of discussion while we've had this ongoing sort of World War I like static battlefield in Bakhmut since last fall, really. A lot of discussion about Ukraine getting ready for a counteroffensive that would try and take back some of the territory that Russia has occupied, somewhat along the lines of what we saw in October in the Kharkiv area, and then somewhat later in Kherson, where the Russians were able to withdraw in a little bit better order than they did out of Kharkiv. Let's talk a little bit about what you think the prospects are for this. I noticed over the weekend, Steve, that Defense Minister Reznikov gave an interview to the Washington Post in which he cautioned people against, too high expectations for what the Ukrainians might accomplish. The New York Times had an article suggesting that there are divisions inside the administration over whether the Ukrainians can actually accomplish a lot, and some suggestion that there's some people who are actually fearful that the Ukrainians will enjoy what General Franks once described in a different context as catastrophic success, that they might be so successful that it could provoke real disorder and unrest in Russia and make it more difficult to negotiate an end to this conflict, if that's even possible. So what do you make of all this, and where do you think we are in the counteroffensive? How do you think it'll go?
Yeah, first, there will be Ukrainian counteroffensive. There's no doubt about that. It probably requires a little bit more drying out of the mud. There have been some really interesting pictures of vehicles bogged down in the mud that results from the thaw and the rains, but that's only a matter of time. Where will the counteroffensive strike? I think, bear in mind, you alluded to Kharkiv and Kherson. Be prepared for some misdirection by the Ukrainians. If you recall last August, they talked about the counteroffensive that was coming in Kherson. And then in September, they struck and they liberated all of Kharkiv. And then it was 2 months later that they turned their attention and were able to push the Russians back across from the western bank of the Dnipro River. So there's going to be some misdirection here. It's going to be, I think, a different conflict for both sides in a way. The Ukrainians will be carrying out, or trying to carry out, a fairly major counteroffensive using combined arms tactics. And the Russians are going to be fighting from prepared defensive positions. So I'm not sure if what we've seen over the past 15 months gives us a lot of basis to judge exactly how this fight will play out. My own expectation, though, is that the Ukrainians will liberate more territory. They will have some success. Whether they can achieve what was called catastrophic success, I'm not sure. But again, I think a catastrophic success, say they, for example, succeeded in driving down to the Sea of Azov and cutting the land bridge between Russia and Crimea, which would be a big step towards isolating occupied Crimea. Catastrophic success actually might cause people, perhaps not Putin, but others in the Kremlin to say, where is this war going? So I'm not sure we should be all that fearful of catastrophic success. Now, also having said that, I believe that while the Ukrainians can probably liberate a lot of territory, getting back to, liberating all of Ukraine, or even getting back to the February 23 line from last year, that's a pretty tough order. It would require probably the collapse of the Russian army in the way that you saw the Russian army collapse in 1918 at the end of World War I. Again, I don't rule that out, but that kind of success, I think, is going to be a tough order. But I do think we're going to see some success by the Ukrainians. The question is how much.
So the Ukrainians have been asking for lots of things, some of which we have given them reluctantly, like tanks. Other things we've been much happier to give them, including armored personnel carriers, bridging equipment, demining equipment. lots of ammunition, of obviously the HIMARS, the longer range artillery with the Gimler's rounds that we've given them, that have extended out their fires quite a bit and played no small role in the Kherson fight. Lots of things, though, that we haven't given them. High performance fighter aircraft like F-16s, ATACMS missiles that would extend the long range fires out to about 300 kilometers, which would allow them to go after the kinds of logistical targets that they went after once we gave them the HIMARS, that enabled them to liberate some of their territory. Now, in the same interview in which he counseled against overly high expectations, Minister Reznikov also sort of, without being explicit about it, basically said if we got these things, it would actually push Russian logistics further and further back, making it more difficult for them to respond to our counteroffensive. So where do you come down on these systems? Do you think we should be supplying them to the Ukrainians? Why do you think that the administration has been so hesitant? What do you make of that whole debate?
Yeah, well, let me just start with what we have given them. I mean, the tanks, armored personnel carriers, Bradley fighting vehicles. I think it would have been in the interest of the United States and the West to give the Ukrainians actually more of that stuff, increasing the prospects that this counteroffensive could be successful. But looking at other weapon systems, ATACMS, I've been arguing since the fall that we should give them ATACMS. What we saw last summer was that the Ukrainians, in a very strategic way, used the Gimler's rockets, which have a range of about 50 miles, to strike Russian command posts and ammunition dumps in occupied Ukraine. That caused the Russians to have to move those ammunition dumps and command posts back 30 or 40 miles. That complicated their effort, and I think that's one of the reasons why in the latter part of the summer you saw the rate of Russian artillery fire begin to decline. It was simply harder to get the shells to the guys who were loading and firing the artillery pieces. ATACMS would allow them to range any Russian target or any in occupied Ukraine. And it would cause them basically to have to pump some of those logistics back into Russia proper. I think that would be useful. I mean, that would further complicate the logistics for the Russians and further degrade their performance on the front line. Now, I think there's one concern out there with the Ukrainians use these to strike targets in Russia. In fact, the Ukrainians have said for, I think, 3 or 4 months now that they would not use Western-provided weapons to strike targets in Russia proper. And by Russia proper, I mean Russia in its 1991 border, not the borders that Putin has been trying to adjust. So I think we could provide some of these systems, and they perhaps would not need a large number, but it could have been very important. On F-16s, I guess I have the feeling I was talking to some other folks about this last week. The conversation that's now going on F-16s kind of strikes me about the same way that the conversation about tanks was going, say, 4 or 5 months ago. My guess is certainly within a year, there will be F-16s given to the Ukrainians. Now, the F-16, in some ways, they may not be the best aircraft for the Ukrainians. The problem is that huge under scoop. They've got to have a pretty clean runway to operate from. But having said that, you've also got, with the F-35s coming out now, lots of F-16s in the American Air Force and in European Air Forces that are either now excess or soon to be excess. And again, my guess is that the Ukrainians could use these for air defense, but also ground attack. And if the Ukrainians continue their policy of not striking targets in Russia with Western-provided weapons, I'm not sure this crosses any red line. You and I both know Alexei Arbatov from our time in Moscow. He had an interview about 3 months ago where he was asked about Kremlin red lines. And the first thing he says, well, they're not explicit. And he's right. They're pretty vague and tacit. But he saw 2 red lines. One was if Western troops were to enter the war. And it's pretty clear, I believe, that Western countries are not going to cross that line, in part because the Ukrainians have never asked for Western troops. But the second line was if the Ukrainians were to use Western-provided weapons to conduct deep strikes into Russia, particularly against cities. And again, the Ukrainians thus far seem to have ruled that out. So it seems to me that there is much more room for the West to be providing the Ukrainians things like advanced fighters, ATACMS, and still be under whatever red line the Kremlin may or may not have. And part of the problem here is the Kremlin has not articulated those red lines in a clear way.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that the Ukrainians have had some of these drone attacks that have been inside Russia, they appeared, first of all, they've been domestically produced drones, not anything supplied to them by the United States.
Exactly. It's a strange kind of war that the Russians are trying to impose on the Ukrainians, where the Russians claim the right to be able to strike any target, military or civilian, anywhere in Ukraine, but somehow it's out of bounds, unfair, and breaking the rules should Ukraine strike anything in Russia.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous. I agree. But I mean, the point I was going to make is even the attacks that I mean, if you're in the administration and you're concerned about the escalatory risks, right, about giving them ATACMS or F-16s, despite the Ukrainian protestations, they won't use them the way we're afraid they might. Their own attacks actually have been very, very strategic. I mean, they've been against air bases, they've been against fuel storage facilities, and things like that. I mean, it seems to me that the Ukrainians have done a pretty good job of this.
Yeah, the Ukrainians have been very discriminate. And they and part of it, I believe, is probably because they have limited resources for conducting those kinds of strikes against targets in Russia proper. But as you said, they've used them to hit military targets.
What's your take, Steve, on why the administration has been so reluctant? I mean, I'm with you. I've been arguing for ATACMS, since last fall as well, and the F-16s at a minimum. Why aren't we training the pilots now, even if it's a ways away? I mean, I think it's a little bit less urgent, the F-16s, because actually the Russians have not, although they on paper have air superiority over Ukraine in terms of number of aircraft and quality of aircraft. The reality is, everything they're firing is pretty much standoff. They seem to be pretty intimidated by Ukrainian air defenses. So I've thought that's as a less high priority. But ATACMS, I don't understand why the administration's been so reluctant. Do you have a view on why they have?
No. First of all, I would agree. I think ATACMS is the more urgent need that would be more usefully incorporated into Ukraine's war plans now. Uh, and the F-16s again it's a lesser priority, but again, it's the kind of thing that we ought to be thinking about now. Um, at one point I heard somebody say that, well, we don't want to give them the F-16s because it would take 2 years to train them how to fly an F-16. No, it would take the U.S. Air Force 2 years to train me, Steve Pfeiffer, probably 3 years to fly an F-16. But we actually, I've talked to somebody in the air, heard from somebody in the Air Force who is an F-16 pilot, and he said, if you take an experienced MiG pilot who's had 4 or 5 years in a MiG, they basically know the basics. It's maybe 6 to 8 weeks to train them how to operate an F-16.
Well, it only took 3 months, right, to train the Ukrainians up on Patriot, and they seem to have knocked down a Kinzhal hypersonic cruise missile, which was supposedly Putin's wonder weapon. That should tell you something about how quickly we can train Ukrainians on advanced systems, right?
And it's not just, I mean, it's sort of across the board. I mean, it's really, I think, been one of the remarkable things of this fight, how quickly the Ukrainians have incorporated equipment into their battle plans and put them to use. And having to cope with things like what they have 5 or 6 different types of artillery pieces coming in from the West. They seem to be making it work. So again, I think that F-16s, it'd be a challenge probably on the maintenance side, but I think the Ukrainians would find ways to overcome it.
On that point which you made, which is, I think, incredibly important and it doesn't get enough stress, the Ukrainians have this kind of really weird petting zoo of systems, right? Because we've got this, jerry-built support system in which our NATO allies and other partners are providing, in some cases, Soviet era equipment from their, although most of that's now exhausted, from their stocks. We've got a variety of different Western systems, whether it's our HIMARS, our M777s, the French César. Problem is, particularly given the volumes of fire, these artillery systems, the tubes need to, after a certain number of firings, need to be switched out and rebored and serviced, etc. So the Ukrainians have had this enormous logistical challenge imposed on them, it's costly in terms of manpower and money. And yet, as you say, Steve, they've seemed to have somehow made this thing work.
Yeah, no, I think it'll be a fascinating story for somebody to write about afterwards, and sort of just exactly how they were able to blend all these systems into their planning and use them in very effective ways. But your question, I mean, I look at the Biden administration, and I give them, I tend to be a tough grader, somewhere between a B and a B plus for how they've handled the last 15 months. In some ways, I think they've done the diplomacy superbly, I mean, particularly in the run up to the war. And one of the reasons why NATO and the G7 and the European Union moved so quickly after the Russians actually launched the full scale invasion in February of last year was because there'd been 3 months of preparing the ground diplomatically led by the United States. And in conversations I've had with administration officials, they say there's really two goals here. One is to help the Ukrainians win and defeat the Russians, and the other one is to avoid a direct NATO Russian military clash. And I agree, those are the right two objectives. But if I had to fault the administration or why I'm not giving them an A, it would be because I think when they blend those objectives, they tend to be a little bit too cautious in a way that, again, from what I can read and see now, maybe there's something in the super secret world that we've missed, but based on the way the Kremlin has acted and what the Kremlin has said, I believe we are somewhat deterring ourselves in terms of the capabilities that we could be providing the Ukrainians. And I point to things that go back to last, I guess it was, or this February, when it was clear that from announcements out of Washington and out of Europe that we were going to begin giving Leopard tanks and a little bit later M1 tanks to the Ukrainians. The Kremlin response was kind of, we don't like it, but I mean, you didn't have them, threatening some large new retaliation. So from what I've seen in the outside world, in the unclassified world, the Russians, are not going to overreact to some of these things. And so we don't have to be as cautious as we have been.
For all those who want to argue that NATO enlargement was somehow responsible for what Putin has done in Ukraine, whether in 2014-15 or the war he started in February 22. I mean, Finland and Sweden, Finland's now in NATO. Sweden hopefully will soon be in NATO. And yet, it hasn't created this kind of huge response from the Russians that people anticipated. So, I mean, I'm with you. I think that the administration has been cautious to a fault and way too willing to let itself be, I don't want to say intimidated, but they've become, I think, way too risk averse. I do agree with you, by the way, as well. I give a very high grade to Secretary Blinken, who I think has done a really good job of, alliance management and coalition maintenance. I don't think any of us would have predicted that NATO would hang together quite as well as it has over the last 15 months. I do give the Secretary of State a lot of credit there. But I just don't understand the high degree of risk aversion, particularly since, as you point out, not just the Leopard and M1A1s. I mean, it's been consistent. I mean, the same was true of the HIMARS and the range that provided. There was a lot of concern about that would be, breaching a red line. They're now getting some MiG-29s from Central Europe. Supposedly that was a red line. So, these lines are, if they're red at all, they're really kind of very pale pink, and they're being breached without any kind of real response. So you would think that the kind of adaptive learning process for the administration would suggest perhaps they don't need to be as risk averse as they have been, but they seem to maintain that concern.
Yeah, and I think there is a risk to being that risk averse, which is the longer this war drags out, the greater the tragedy for Ukraine. But I do think that the longer this war goes, as you said, I have been impressed and surprised by how well Europe and the West have hung together on this. My guess is few people would have predicted in February of 2022 that you would have, the amount of support going to Ukraine, the weapons going to Ukraine, the sanctions still being maintained on Russia. So that's gone well. But my guess is it's going to get tougher the longer the war goes on. and sort of sustaining that support, I think, is a real question, including in the United States. So I'd rather see kind of a push to get the Ukrainians more of the wherewithal they need to try to resolve this sooner rather than
No,
later.
I agree with that, and I think there's actually polling data to support this. There's a recent poll that I think both you and I are aware of by Shibley Tilhami at the University of Maryland that does show that after quite a long period of pretty robust support, there's beginning to be a little bit of decline in public support for aiding the Ukrainians. Some of that's being driven by, Trump and DeSantis and Josh Hawley and other Republican leaders who are, Tucker Carlson, who are have been critiquing this policy all along. But some of it's coming from independents and Democrats as well. And I do think there is a risk that we can fall into of playing a too long game that I think Putin thinks plays to his strengths rather than ours, undermines public support in the US and then potentially Europe as well. But also in Shibley's polls, he finds that the public actually has pretty high tolerance for giving the Ukrainians everything they need to win this now. It's that the public doesn't want another endless war. They want to, see this, over and done with as soon as possible. So I think there's political support for it.
Yeah, and I also, I mean, this is the curious thing. I mean, I don't pretend to understand all the calculations in the White House about politics, but it would seem to me that, of course, the 2024 election will be decided first and foremost on domestic issues. But to the extent that foreign policy issues come into play, Russia, Ukraine is going to be one. And my guess is that on that issue, the president's going to be in a much stronger position in 2024 if Ukraine has either won or is clearly winning the war, as opposed to if Russia has prevailed or if there's a long stalemate.
I agree with that. So let's talk about the prospect for negotiations. I mean, the Wall Street Journal had a story today that there is, growing consensus, they say, in Western diplomatic chanceries and in Washington that there's going to be some kind of negotiation. Increasing thought that China might play some kind of role in mediating or brokering some kind of agreement, including people pointing to statements that Tony Blinken has made suggesting some openness on the part of the administration to the PRC playing this role. Henry Kissinger, I think it was yesterday or maybe the day before, who's about to turn 100 later this month, who said now that China is involved in this, he's confident there's going to be a negotiation sort of by the end of the year between the two. I'm not as confident as he is that there's going to be any negotiation. I don't see any disposition on the part of Vladimir Putin to negotiate anything. And I think given the ferocity of the Russian assault on Ukrainian nationhood, the war crimes, the abduction of children, the kidnappings, I mean, everything we've seen, whatever room for maneuver President Zelensky might have had, before this war started back in January of 2022, is much less now than it was then. And you see that in polling of Ukrainians, that Ukrainians have not very much interest right now in negotiating with Russians. And I certainly can understand that. What do you make of, this Chinese potential role as a mediator and prospects for negotiation? Are you as bearish as I am about them?
Yeah, for I mean, I believe at some point there will be a negotiation between Kyiv and Moscow, but I don't see any prospect of that anytime soon. The positions right now, they're just, I mean, there's no overlap. I mean, and one of the bizarre things here is that Russian demands of Kyiv have escalated even when they were losing on the battlefield. I mean, there's this real disconnect in Moscow. In August and September last year, Russian forces were being driven back in Kharkiv. They were coming back under greater pressure in Kherson. They were making no progress in Donbass. And then at the end of September, Putin sort of escalates his demands by saying Ukraine now has to recognize that we have annexed Zaporizhia, Luhansk, Kherson, and Donetsk. So I think there's just at this point there's no reason to think a negotiation would work. The Chinese, it's interesting, but I think the Chinese have to do more than simply put down a list of 12 principles. And a lot of those principles are very good: support for territorial integrity, that sort of thing. But nowhere in those principles did you see withdrawal of forces from the other guy's territory. And at least I'm prepared to have the Chinese persuade me otherwise. But right now, it seems to me that that piece of paper and a couple of phone calls were designed to allow China to say, we're a big player in world affairs. We have a plan on the table. We want peace. But quite frankly, if the Chinese are really serious, they're the ones who have significant leverage with the Russians. There's no sign that they've applied that leverage. Now, at this point, I don't think the West, and to their credit, I don't think the Biden administration has done this. The West should not be trying to push Zelensky into a premature negotiation. The negotiation, when it happens, I think requires two things. First of all, an adjustment in the Kremlin's negotiating approach, where it looks like, in fact, they are beginning to accept some of the battlefield realities. And that means shedding some of their more bizarre demands. And then on the Ukrainian side, this gets, Eric, into the point that you raised, is I think the Ukrainian government in the first weeks of the war, I think, was looking for a way to end it. They offered neutrality. They even made some hints that struck me as offering readiness to compromise on territorial issues. That changed over the course of March of last year, particularly when places like Bucha and Irpin were liberated, and the Ukrainians saw the atrocities, the mass graves, the torture chambers, the reports of rapes, the forced deportation of Ukrainian children. And it seems to me that attitudes, both in the government, but also in the broader public, hardened in a way that some of the ideas that I believe Zelensky was prepared to consider in the first couple of weeks of March of last year, he's not prepared to consider now. And if he was prepared to consider them, he could never sell it to the Ukrainian public. So I think we have to recognize that even once Moscow begins, if I think it'll still be at some point when Moscow begins to get a bit more serious about a negotiation, it's got to be a call by the Ukrainian leadership, because they probably cannot go into a negotiation and get everything they want. There'll have to be some compromises, but those compromises could be extremely controversial within Ukraine. So I think the West, on the one hand, we should not be pushing the Ukrainians into negotiation. At the end of the day, also, if the Ukrainians accept some settlement that may fall short of the demands they have now, we also should not interfere with that. This should be a call for Kyiv.
My own sense of this, and I have absolutely no direct evidence to support what I'm about to say, but I'll say it anyway. I was puzzling a little bit about Secretary Blinken's comments about the PRC. I mean, because among other things, you mentioned the list of principles that the Chinese announced around the time of the Xi Putin meeting. One of the things that was notably missing was any kind of strictures against, aggression, armed aggression against your neighbors. And so, it's not completely clear to me how much of a really neutral sort of interlocutor and potential mediator the Chinese can be. I mean, your colleague at Stanford, former Ambassador Mike McFaul, has pointed out that I think it's Ambassador Lee, who has been appointed as the Chinese envoy, is actually a pretty pro-Russian guy. He was Mike's counterpart, I think, in Moscow as the PRC ambassador there when Mike was ambassador in the Obama administration. And so, to me, I was trying to puzzle out why would the administration be, so open, quote unquote, to doing this. And it occurred to me that there might be actually a good reason for them to do that, which is we know that they have been urging the Chinese not to provide any lethal assistance as the Russians run down their own stocks of ammunition, whether it's artillery ammunition or precision guided munitions, et cetera, which we know they're now getting very low on. And, we see them using S-400 air defense missiles and Bastion coastal defense missiles in an offensive mode, which is obviously not desirable or, not the way they're designed to be used. It occurred to me that the administration may want to try and use this Chinese offer of mediation as a way to keep them kind of from not playing in the competition between Ukraine and Russia for military assistance by basically, well, if you want to be a mediator, we're open to that, but you can't be really, backing one side if you're going to play that role. And that, I think, would make some sense.
Yeah, no, that could be possible. But again, I think, but part of it is sort of pushing them the burden on the Chinese. The Chinese have to show that they're serious. And again, to my mind, a serious effort by the Chinese means that they use some of this leverage that they have with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I very much agree. I wanted to just talk briefly about President Zelensky's speech. I know you haven't had a chance to, read it in full, but today is VE Day in the United States and Europe. Tomorrow is Victory Day in Moscow because at the time that the Allies took the Nazi surrender in 1945, it was already May 9th in Moscow because of the time difference. Yeah. President Zelensky today, interestingly, in his speech, it seemed to me was engaging in a bit of an attempt to deal with President Putin's cultural appropriation of Ukrainian history in his own, 7,000 word essay back in the summer of 2021, in which he essentially denied that Ukraine is a nation or even a separate people from the Russians. President Zelensky was, number one, saying that he's asking the Ukrainian Rada to change the law to make VE Day May 8th so that Ukraine will be aligned with us and the West in celebration of the end of the war, but also was using it to discuss the fact that the war between the Nazis and the Soviet Union was largely fought out in Ukraine. And it was Ukrainians who did the bulk of the suffering and the bulk of the fighting, for that matter, in World War II. And so from that point of view, was a very, interesting speech, I thought. Again, a kind of one of his, I think, kind of tour de forces, which we're getting used to now. But I just wonder if you have some thoughts about that, having served as ambassador there and knowing this history as well as you do.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, Putin has tried to appropriate the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. And, I mean, the Soviets deserve a lot of credit. They fought probably 3 times as many divisions on the Russian front as the Western Allies did in France and Italy. But it was the Soviets, it was not Russia. And Putin now seems to pretend that this history is just to the credit of Russia, when in fact, if you look at other parts of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, Belarus, those countries were fully occupied by the German army in World War II. A relatively small portion of what was then the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was occupied by the Nazis. And on a proportionate basis, Ukraine and more so Belarus suffered far more greatly than Russia did. So this effort by Putin to pretend this is just a Russian victory, it's his effort to abuse history and use it to a purpose, I think, for his domestic audience primarily.
Our guest has been Steve Pifer. Steve, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to have you. Unfortunately, we could go on, I think, for hours talking about this, but you have other things to do. If you enjoyed today's podcast, drop us a line at shieldoftherepublic@gmail.com or give us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And we will see you next week.
Thanks very much, Eric.